Feminism is a branch of Satanism. Now gather around, come closely, because we need to have a serious conversation. Feminism is a direct extension of Satanism. Whoa, what do you mean, Lucas? What does feminism have to do with Satanism? Well, let's talk about it. See, I had a very disturbing conversation over the weekend with a black woman who is a radical feminist. And let's break this down, because feminism was never meant to advance the lives of women. It was always an insidious trick brought to women by Satan to get them to go against God, amongst other things. It has nothing to do with pay and getting jobs, because let's admit, for the past 5 to 6 decades and generations, there's nothing that men can do in this country that women can't do. Point in fact, some might argue that women have more rights than men when it comes to the judicial system, courts, and when it comes to other things, right? But let's talk about how feminism is Satanism. It convinced women to go against God. It convinced women to delete their babies in the womb. It convinced women to transgender their children. It convinced women to divorce their husbands. And it convinced women to denounce femininity and denounce marriage. All in all, it convinced women to destroy the family. And there's nothing more than what Satan likes than to get people to break up their families and to go against God. So let's talk about this even deeper, right? This black woman that I was having a conversation with, and I found it interesting that feminism started with white women and the suffragette, and then it fast forward and black women took it to a whole nother umpteenth level. They turned it into radical feminism, and I've never seen anybody embrace radical feminism more than the black woman, and it's destroying them. It's destroying the family, and it's just such a disgrace. So this black woman, she was referring to God as a she, and I had to stop her. I asked, like, wait, what do you mean she? And she said, yeah, God is a woman. She also said that God made Eve first. And I said, well, that's just factually not correct. I don't care what religion you are or what you believe. We all know that Adam was here first. I said, do you even believe in Adam and Eve? And she said, yeah, I believe in Adam and Eve was first. I said, how is that possible? I said, it doesn't matter what book of scriptures you read, whether it's the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran. God is very clear that he made Adam out of clay. And Adam existed as the only human for a while doing God's work. And then God brought Adam a helpmeet in the form of Eve as his companion. And then she went against that and she said, no, that's not true. She said, if Adam was first, are you trying to say that he gave birth, that he was pregnant? And I looked at her as if she was crazy, because this literally was crazy. I said, what are you talking about? Nobody said anything about Adam being pregnant. Adam was first, and God made Eve out of his rib. And she said, no, that's not true. She said Eve was first, and I know that because God told me, God spoke to me, and I read it. And I asked her, I said, well, what book did you read that in? Because I would like to go and read it too. And she refused to tell me. She said, I'm not telling you. You got to find it on your own. You got to talk to God and discover it on your own. I said, God already told me. God already told me how the creation of man works. So I'm asking you, you said that you read it in a book. I would like to know what book you read that in so that I can go read it as well. And she said, I'm not telling you, but Eve was first. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. And she said, you have a mother, don't you? I said, yeah, I have a mother. What does that have to do with anything? She said, all right, mother is God. And I said, what? You're saying mother is God? I said, I have a mother and a father, but that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about. God is not a woman. And then she said, yes, God is. God is a woman, and Eve was first. And this was so diabolical on so many levels, I had to stop her, and I told her, look, God didn't tell you that. I'm sorry to tell you, but that was Satan that told you that. Satan wants you to say diabolical things and debaucherous things about God. Satan wants you to say things like God is a woman, but it's not true. And she said, yes, it is. And I just couldn't believe it. At that point, I had to pretty much end the conversation after so much back and forth. Now, all of this started because I told her that I was denouncing identifying myself as a Cancerian. I don't follow astrology anymore. I threw away my astrology books, and I told her that God is very clear that astrology is of the occult. You know, he put the sun, the stars, and the moon here for direction, guidance, and for telling the time of day, time of month, time of year, etc. We're not supposed to look to astrology for guidance. We're supposed to look to God only for guidance, right? when I said guidance for the moon, I meant guidance as in direction. That's what we're supposed to look for the moon and the sun for. And then she went off on a tangent about how God is a woman. That's when she started referring to God as a she. And I just thought this was so representative, because I've heard other women say that as well too, that God is a woman. And it's just such a shame, because women, if they only knew, if these feminists only knew, of course not all women, if they only knew that their superpower was femininity, but they look down on femininity, and they're competing with men in some kind of hierarchy position, and they're demonizing the patriarchy, they're demonizing God's order. God was very clear: God, man, woman, and child. And if you don't believe that, then you just don't believe in God. And I'm like, what church do you go to that tells you that God is a woman? Because that is blasphemous. Eve was not first, and God is not a woman. Jump down in the comments and let me know what you think about this. And another thing, when I started telling her that was Satan that was directing her to say God is a woman, and that was not God, she started calling me a male chauvinist. She said, I'm a male chauvinist and I hate women. And I said, how am I a male chauvinist for telling you the word of God? And she said, that's not the word of God. That's the word of man. And I just had to get up and walk away.